Oh, God.
All right,
There are people.
let's get started. My name is Rod Ewing. I'm a co-director here at CISAC, and it's my pleasure to host today's research seminar, which will be given by Bárbara Cruvinel Santiago. Just a few words about Bárbara. She got her Ph.D. at Columbia working on astronomical instrumentation supported by NASA. Her BS is in physics at Yale. She was one of the inaugural fellows of the Next Generation Fellowship from the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction and received the 2021 American Physical Society Sigma Physicist Award for congressional advocacy in nuclear disarmament. Bárbara, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rob, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So today I'll be telling you a little bit about a project that I started this year. As Rod mentioned, I pursue my PhD in astronomical instrumentation, so bear with me as I'm going through this process because it's an ongoing project. So to get us started, I wanted to tell you a little bit of background of how I got interested in this project and why I think it's important. So when I was oops, this is not working. Okay, now it's working. So when I was a graduate student, when I was not staring at the night sky in an observatory in Arizona, I was usually working in Pupin Hall. And Pupin Hall is the place that is the home of the physics department at Columbia University. The thing that Pupin is known for is, one of the things that it's known for is for having had the first time in which an uranium atom was split in the US. So kind of kickstarting the Manhattan Project. And when you walk through Pupin Hall for the front door and you look to your left, the first thing you see is all of these faces of scientists that participated in the Manhattan Project. And right next to their faces, you see the contribution that each of them made to science. What you don't see when you walk through the doors and when you look at the plaques is actually the dire consequences that their research actually had to the rest of humanity. You cannot even see like a mention of how they used to have like Columbia students carry radioactive material with their bare hands into Pupin to pursue their experiments. And one of the things that bother me the most about the scientific community, but about physicists more generally, more specifically, is that when we talk about research, physicists tend to pursue their research because they're interested in it. They think it's interesting, but they don't necessarily think about what's going to happen to society if I put this information out there. As a quote here from an article about the Manhattan Project at Columbia, Salvadori, who was a physicist who worked with Fermi on the Manhattan Project, said that I asked Fermi once, how do you feel? And he said, I was put on this earth in order to make certain discoveries. What people and politicians do with them is something I don't care and I don't worry about. And I personally think that physicists and scientists more broadly should worry about the consequences of the type of work that they put out there. So as a little bit of an overview of how this talk is going to go, I'll tell you a little bit more motivation for the project that I'm pursuing, which is, and then try to answer the question of how can we make a framework that scientists can use to kind of evaluate the risk that their research is going to have to the public more broadly. And I'll show you one of the case studies that have been, one of the two case studies that I've been pursuing this year and give you a few examples of projects that I've been evaluating over the last several months. So as a little bit more of motivation into this project, on top of like scientists needing more of a framework to analyze the research that they're pursuing, when we think about the non-proliferation regime, and I'm defining the non-proliferation regime here as the treaties for non-proliferation and the agencies that enforce those treaties, they have ways to determine how about like a budding nuclear weapons project is starting in a given country, but they're typically very related to things that we're classically associate with nuclear development. What they don't have is a framework to evaluate contemporary research, and I mean research that is being developed right now, like in the last 2 to 5 years, and how that's going to have ramifications in the future. And despite the fact that current nuclear weapons are actually very deadly. They're roughly the ones that are deployed right now, even though the more powerful ones have been retired already. Even the ones that are being deployed right now are about 5 times more powerful than the ones that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientists and physicists, more specifically, are still working on research that have the potential of making these bombs even more deadly. For example, fusion, or they're making tactical nuclear weapons that are smaller but more usable and can lead to a little bit of a more dire future. And despite that, there are only a couple of frameworks out there that already exist to evaluate how academic research is actually contributing to the weapons complex. One of them is a report that was put out in 2019 by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and they identified 49 different universities that have been contributing to the nuclear weapons complex in some way. But the way that they defined that is whether they were doing direct management of the nuclear weapons program, they had institutional partnerships with nuclear weapons labs, if they had research programs that were working directly on the stockpile in the US, or they were developing the pipeline of scientists that will eventually work on nuclear weapons. Another framework that also exists is a report that was recently, or not that recently, but in 2017 was published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And they were trying to identify ways in which you can see that a specific country is starting a nuclear weapons program. But the way that they defined that was by things that are classically associated with nuclear weapons development, like reactor operations, control of the fuel cycle, delivery system, military structures. Things that they don't do, though, is look at research that has been developed in the last 2 to 5 years and see, like, does that have a potential to be weaponized in the next 2-3 decades? So my question to kind of start my project was, can we develop a framework that actually identifies how weaponizable any kind of academic research really is? And the way that I define this in my project is kind of two-pronged. So I define weaponizable as something that is aiding in the development of nuclear weapons, more specifically, or that is aiding in the development of delivery vehicles for those weapons. And there are 2 ways in which I'm defining dual purpose for the specific projects that I've been pursuing. One of them is by dividing research between civilian and the military. So academic research that is pursued in civilian institutions, but that is aiding the military, even if it's unwarranted or if they don't intend to do so. And the other one is nuclear research versus nuclear weapons research in the military. And that's going to be a little clearer when I show you this next slide. So the 2 projects that I've been pursuing this year, one is to evaluate projects that are funded by the National Nuclear Security Administration in academic institutions in the US. And the other one is the Brazilian nuclear power submarine and how that can, like, it's not a nuclear weapons project, but has the potential to be, or has the potential for weaponization in certain instances. In the interest of time, because I try to time this talk to about 30 minutes, so we have time for discussion, I'll be focusing on the NNSA funded projects. But if you have other questions about the Brazilian nuclear submarine, I'm also happy to answer them later today. So to kind of give you a little bit of background on the projects that I've been analyzing that are funded by the National Nuclear Security Administration, I've been focusing on their academic alliances program. And the reason why I've been focusing on those is that the people who are funded by this program do not have any contracts with the military, do not have any contracts to manage the stockpile. They are funded solely for the sake of science, supposedly, and to develop their scientific workforce. And so I got the projects that were funded in 2022. And the reason why I got those projects is because the whole list of proposals that were funded is actually publicly available. And it gives us a couple of years to kind of evaluate, like, outputs from those projects. And then my thinking behind this was, well, the NNSA funds projects, even though it's for academic purposes only, the NNSA is interested in developing the stock, or in developing and maintaining the stockpile in the US. So it's going to be funding research that is going to be associated with nuclear weapons somehow. So it's kind of a get list to kind of start a framework to try to evaluate what research poses risks in the future for weaponization, not just in the US, but also elsewhere if it's being pursued, if similar research is being pursued elsewhere. So I want to make very clear what this project is trying to do and what this project is not trying to do to kind of set ground rules for the things that I'm going to be presenting. So things that I want to do with this project is kind of make a framework that scientists can use to evaluate the risk of their research so they can decide where they are going to get funding, how they are going to be publishing this, how they are going to be pursuing their research, and whether or not they want to make certain aspects of their research publicly available. Enable funders who do not want to engage in nuclear weapons research to identify whether or not they want to fund a project and make more informed decisions about that. And also enable the non-proliferation regime to understand that budding nuclear weapons programs do not necessarily have just classic signs of weaponization. And they can use that as kind of a framework. What this project does not intend to do is make judgment calls on what people should fund or not at the moment. Determine if a research project should and should not be pursued, and what is ethical and what is not. And I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend that I'm making an all-encompassing like framework for everything that is going to be weaponizable in the future, but it's like I'm trying to make a dent in that regard. So the way that we've been pursuing this project, when I started last year, it was just a year after the projects had been funded. So there was not much publicly available information other than just the list of proposals. So I was like scavenging the internet, trying to find papers that people were publishing, trying to associate them with the proposals, trying to find what people were putting in acknowledgements. But I didn't know for sure that those projects were actually the things that were being funded by those proposals. But then just 2 months ago, the NNSA, whether it was because they wanted to do that or not, I don't know if they made it publicly available out of the goodness of their heart, or if they didn't want to make it available, but somehow all of the slides from the symposium that was hosted for every single one of the proposals that were funded in 2022 were made available. And then suddenly 2 months ago, I got access to information about all of these projects, and they're a direct match from the proposal titles to the presentations that I'm analyzing. And so I established this what I'm calling a reading group or an expert survey. And this reading group has expertise in several fields, mostly in physics. And it's going to be clear why that is actually a good start for it, probably not the end of it. But there are people here with expertise in math and engineering and nuclear physics, neutrino physics, theoretical physics, plasma physics, quantum science, atomic physics, astrophysics. So kind of encompassing a good chunk of the fields that are encompassed in the list of proposals that I'm evaluating. So we go for the reading group. So I distributed those slides and those materials, and I'll give you examples of what these materials look like to this group. And we're trying to get each project analyzed by 2 people at a time to kind of prevent some sort of bias, people who have expertise in that specific kind of project. And then there's a survey, and they fill it out separately about what is this project about, what are they trying to do, what calculations might be helpful to evaluate the risk of this project. What do you think the timeline for this project is? What do you think the timeline for a follow-up project to kind of try to weaponize that kind of knowledge is? So from that, we try to evaluate the risks, and each project actually kind of requires specific knowledge and specific ways to evaluate the risk. So there isn't a generalized way to do that for every single project because they are in several different fields. But in general, we're trying to get to the root of how do we calculate the risk for each type of project. Then we registered this data. I don't have all of the data right now because it was only published 2 months ago. So we're trying to collect that. So everything that I'll tell you moving forward is my own personal judgment on that. So take that with a grain of salt as my judgment on those projects. But eventually we want to make a framework based on the data that we're collecting from this expert survey to try to evaluate the risk of different kinds of projects in the physical sciences. So a few examples of materials that we get from those slides. One of them is we get pretty detailed descriptions of what these projects are trying to accomplish and what these projects are trying to do. Sometimes we get the actually most times we get the experimental setup that these projects are using, and the methodology that they are using to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. A lot of them, if not all of them, have preliminary results. And sometimes they have preliminary results and they don't have much description, but sometimes they do come even with commentary from the speakers, like speakers' notes that have pretty detailed descriptions of what they're trying to do in those plots. And also, a lot of them have lists of publications, so we have access to external material on top of the slides to actually make judgment calls on those projects. Sure, PIs sometimes tend to inflate the list of publications that are coming from a specific proposal, but given the fact that we have what the description of the project is, we can make a judgment call on whether that project is associated with the paper that they are listing. So from that information, we're still processing, we're still evaluating each one of those projects, trying to get 2 people at a time to evaluate each project. So take the information that I'll give you right now with a grain of salt. But out of the 36 projects, about 17 of them are in physics departments. A few of them are not in fields that you would typically associate with nuclear weaponization, like astrophysics, condensed matter, plasma physics. And also there are closely related fields with PIs in physics departments. So when or with PIs with training in physics. So it was a good call to have like physicists in the first group of people who are going to evaluate the first few of the projects. But even those fields are in planetary sciences, things that you wouldn't even associate with nuclear weapons at a first glance. But even at a first glance, when I was looking for the projects, and I'm not saying that's the call that other people made, so that's not the final data for the project yet, I made the judgment call that about 23 of those 36 projects have a potential of weaponization in the next few decades. But even then, only one of them mentions weapons in any of their materials. And that project is this one. And what they were trying to do is essentially try to see how the way in which you deposit layers of materials when you're making a device is actually going to influence the microstructure of a material that can be used to test the resistance of the material, and that can be used for nuclear bombs, for example. But when you look at all of their publicly available materials, all they mention is how their research is applicable to the auto industry. So that was the first sign that this is of dual purpose. It's like, well, if I look at projects that are trying to characterize the microstructure of a material, I might be looking into something that might be related to nuclear weapons down the road. Other kinds of examples of that are not so obviously related to nuclear weaponization are projects in the planetary sciences, for example. In this specific case, this project was funded to investigate novel states, properties, and chemistry of low-Z planetary mixtures under extreme conditions. In other words, they're trying to get low metallicity materials, meaning that they're materials that have, or elements that have low count of protons, and try to see how they perform under extreme conditions, so high temperature, high pressure. But the way that I translate that is, so they're trying to evaluate how planetary cores work. The way that I translate that is, how does hydrogen and helium work if there's a ton of pressure applied to it? Can you think of anything that is related to that? Probably a hydrogen bomb. And hydrogen bombs are things that already exist. So this kind of knowledge could add very quickly to how can we make hydrogen bombs a little more powerful. But the only technology that they say that they want to develop with this is enabling high pressure and high temperature technology to be produced for them to have an experiment on Earth that they can probe to analyze how planetary cores are formed. But I think that this kind of project has other technology developments that are associated with it, and that's why the NNSA was interested in it. But if other funders like a private foundation or NSF or NASA are trying to fund that, they might be interested in it for other reasons. In non-nuclear weapons, they might have a right to know that this is something that the nuclear weapons enterprise is also interested in. Things that have more of a long-term, maybe dual purpose is, for example, research on this. The goal of this project is essentially to measure the physical properties of major building blocks of Earth life and water world planets in order to develop better models of, and they go on to describe lots of different things that are associated with planetary structures, like atmospheres and cores. But this project was called Z2 Planet. So one thing that you can think of, one way in which I translated that, they are trying to see how hydrogen and helium eventually fuse to become other materials that will eventually become planetary cores. So in other words, how does fusion work? And fusion has been seen at a rate in which it produces more energy than it actually consumes for the first time just under 2 years ago in a weapons lab. So sure, this is not going to be weaponizable in the next 2-3 decades, potentially, but it's one way in which fusion research can actually be framed and can show up in literature in other places. On the other end of the stick, we also have some research that is trying to evaluate things that are dual purpose, but on the other end of it is trying to do research that evaluates, for example, how plutonium pits age. And I think that's actually very valuable. For example, if you're trying to evaluate, is it really necessary for us to have new plutonium pits? So that's not weaponizable, but dual purpose in a way. Or trying to evaluate how the plutonium pit production is going to impact local environments and local populations around them. Other ways, other projects that I have found that are not weaponizable, clearly not weaponizable, for example, detection of neutrinos, which they claim to be able to aid in inspection and verification. It's probably not going to be doing that in the next 2-3 decades, because neutrinos are some of the particles that are the most difficult to detect because they are lightweight, they don't have charge, they fluctuate a lot, they change flavors and disguise themselves in experiments. But that's the kind of research that is clear, not dual purpose, and how we identify that kind of thing. So as possible future directions for how this project's going to go. So I'm not going to be pursuing full-time nuclear security research moving forward, but this is going to hopefully take the form of a project that is going to become a public report in which people can evaluate the types of research that can have the potential to be weaponizable in the future. So from them, there is an initiative maybe with the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction to try to evaluate the ethical implications of physicists and scientists working in nuclear weapons that is going to come in the near future, probably in the next few months. So maybe use that public report to kind of inform those kinds of discussions, inform what kinds of safeguards and verification do we need for the near future or for the long-term future for those kinds of technologies that are being developed right now. And then I'm trying to think of, can we expand this project to kind of correlate the projects that are funded by the NNSA right now that we identify as potential weaponization features to projects that are funded by other funders, like NASA, NSF, private funders. And can we eventually maybe have a large language model that gets, well, these projects have this kinds of language, this kind of language associated with them in their papers. For example, it's related to the auto industry, it's not related to weapons. And then kind of mine other papers that are coming out and kind of see how budding nuclear weapons research is starting elsewhere, and try to do that from those projects and from that initial report. And that's it for now. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Barbara. Just to remind everyone of the rules, if you're an online viewer and have questions, please submit those to the question and answer folder on Zoom, and I'll try to weave those questions into questions that we have here in person. And the first questions go to the fellows. Okay, Lindsay.
Also had a question.
And please identify yourself.
Hi, Barbara.
Yeah.
Lindsay, I'm a postdoc.
It's mainly for the online audience.
Okay. Well, I think it's really interesting. I don't remember the exact number, but that a significant portion of the projects are going to schools that are not listed in the ICANN methodology. Do you have or could you just give a very brief overview of what the ICANN methodology is? And sorry if I missed it.
I think I mean, it's been a while since I read that report, but I think they are just trying to figure out like which projects are aiding directly the nuclear weapons enterprise, and they try to look for, I think, for places that are being funded somehow, whether to produce a pipeline of scientists or have direct management projects that are associated with nuclear weapons labs. I don't think they looked at the full list of the Academic Alliances program, which also relates to nuclear weapons somehow. So maybe that's something that is adding to that framework that they didn't have right there.
Right, Max, and if you want to get in the queue, just send me a. Okay.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks for the great talk. I'm Max, a postdoc here at CISAC, Design of AI Safety, and SARI. And so this might be a bit of a personally biased question because as someone in a former life who did like nuclear and particle physics at a nuclear research facility and stuff like that, I'm wondering, only pinned to the point, catching nuclear weapons programs early, if it might be possible to use your framework or something similar to focus on the researchers and the skills they develop rather than the actual research, which again, like from my bias experience, can be really narrowly focused on something very specific, while you still do a lot of understanding about nuclear material interactions, modeling, and even using, like also in my case, numerical programs that you have to sign for because they can be used to simulate fission reactions and stuff like that. So bottom line, do you think it's valuable to also focus on the researchers and trying to use the tools and framework to then not only find papers and then make a list of the researchers in some countries that then might be able to start a nuclear weapons program instead of doing it the specific research output of the papers? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. That's something that actually Matt, who was in the reading group, has suggested, is just like doing kind of, and I'm thinking of doing, maybe talking to someone who does, what is it called, network science, and then they kind of like see who is coming out of the Academic Alliances program and then ending up in nuclear weapons program, and what is the rate that people are doing that? Like, are they going to nuclear weapons labs and developing nuclear weapons programs after developing those kinds of skills? So I think that's another way to look into it. Obviously, I only had a few months to kind of evaluate the project, so I haven't been looking at like the specific researchers, but it's definitely, and also I don't want to label people like you're the bad guy who's definitely going to make a list that I'm going to blacklist scientists because they're going to work on nuclear weapons. But yeah, it's definitely it would definitely be interesting to see what kind of pipeline is this, are these kinds of academic only programs producing to nuclear weapons research later on. But yeah, it's definitely something that would be interesting to look into.
Any other questions from fellows? Let's move. Harold, I think you're next.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for your talk. I know you said you weren't talking about it in the time, but you know of my own personal interest in Brazil and nuclear issues, and I wanted to just sort of open a space where you could maybe comment a little bit on that. And specifically what I'm interested in is hearing more about how does, I think you're in a unique place to compare how the US system for funding nuclear related research compares to the Brazilian system. And I'm thinking about the Brazilian nuclear submarine because there's also sort of a technology transfer component, I believe, from working with the French. So maybe you could just give that side-by-side comparison, and so kind of, and what data would you therefore need for Brazil as opposed to
Yeah, so it's interesting because I mean, there are specific companies, for example, Amazon, that works on like developing nuclear weapons projects in Brazil. There's a commission on nuclear research. So like if you see the things that are coming out of there, they typically fund more academic programs than, because there isn't a nuclear weapons program, and there's more publicly available data from the nuclear projects that are being pursued in Brazil. One thing that I've been you also have like, you can actually, there's a portal in Brazil in which you can just type in the projects that you're trying to get the funding from, and they give you the breakdown of how the funding was used, and it divides by like if you're just a citizen scientist or if you're a person who has more specific knowledge about those projects. So like you can track the funding a little more closely, I think, in the Brazilian platform than you can in the US. And I think that's on purpose because the US has interest in nuclear weapons and Brazil does not. Yeah, it was interesting because I was actually talking to Rose recently because she was interested in, some of her colleagues were interested in how the Brazilian project was progressing and what kind of implications that would have for inspection and verification of both AUKUS and the Brazilian submarine, because the Brazilian submarine is going to come online first, potentially, if there are no more delays, which, I mean, I doubt there won't be any more delays, but it's been delayed for a pretty long time. But it was interesting because, like, if I could look up the funding and the funding was readily, you could see where the funding was going, but also, yeah, there's a little more transparency, I think.
It's interesting because I did some track twos.
But there's also much less funding.
Yeah, no, but it's also, I think the AUKUS comparison is interesting because a BAC Brazilian program, I believe, allows for inspections of military facilities.
Yeah.
Which is how the Brazilian Navy argues that
The,
they would still be compliant even with nuclear submarines. But that was like 10 years ago. So I don't know what's changed since then.
I think it seems like Brazil has been trying to work with the IAEA on an agreement to try to how the inspections for the submarine will go once they start the production of the nuclear power submarine. Because right now they're still finalizing 2 conventional submarines on the plant where they're going to actually build the nuclear power submarine. But yeah, I think there has been discussion there. It was in the news recently, but there's also a question of whether those discussions were in the news and Brazil was a little more compliant, or like was saying that it was more compliant in the news because of government propaganda, because they're worried about what the inspections are going to look like. But there definitely has been an uptick in news about the how the inspections are going to go. And I can actually, I'm writing my memo for the memo that we have to do for the workshop about it. So you read about that.
Right, Cameron, hold your question. I'd like to weave in a question from the audience, and this is from Callie, one of the fellows here. Great talk, Barbara. I'm a biosecurity postdoc at CISAC. I really am inspired by other folks who are trained as scientists and who are doing what they can to help scientists see the social and political ramifications of their work. I'm wondering what you think STEM graduate programs can do to help instill researchers with a sense of responsibility for the implications of their research if it is dual use.
I think the first thing would be to start talking about that. I think that as a student, until I joined the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, I never had a discussion with anyone about the ramifications of my projects or whether it could be used in military applications that I wasn't intending my project to be a part of. And I think it just starts by having discussions and having seminars and having conversations in which students can be a part of. And that starts in undergrad. It's not just in graduate school. Another thing that came up when I was giving a talk at ISA earlier this semester, that someone in the audience mentioned that chemists have an ethical, like a set of ethical guidelines that they follow to, they have to follow to pursue their research solely for peaceful purposes. And that chemists that are part of the American Chemistry Association, whatever it is, have to follow. I think that other sciences should probably have those sets of ethical guidelines as well to be followed. I think that's the bare minimum. But yeah, I think there's a lack of discussion about it. If you go into the Columbia Physics website, for example, and you see how they literally describe Keep Hall as being the starting site of the Manhattan Project, and they go into like this huge description of how the science has come, how great the science was, but there's literally zero discussion about what the consequences of that science is. And I think we have to start acknowledging that in the scientific community.
Right, now to Cameron.
Cameron Tracy, research scholar at CISAC. I have a question about the incentives involved in this shifting of work from the weapons complex to universities. So on the academic side, that seems obvious. They get grant money. On the weapons complex side, though, it seems perhaps more complicated. I'd imagine some of this work could be carried out within the national labs. So is this more of a workforce development program? Is it work that couldn't actually be carried out in the labs, or is there something else going on to incentivize on their side this whole process?
I think you answered that. I mean, the way that they describe the program is that we want to develop the pipeline. We want to develop knowledge in general, but mostly they want to get the pipeline of scientists put together because people need graduate degrees to be able to work on research in the weapons labs afterwards, and they need the skills to be able to work on those projects after they get their PhDs. So I think it's definitely more workforce development focused.
Harold, two fingers.
I just wanted to follow up on Cameron's point because I think this is an interesting area. One of the things I was thinking about while you were talking in your presentation was sort of the non-weaponizable, if I understood you correctly, and are those, do you think, are NNSA investing in, again, it's a workforce development thing, so even if it's not right now, these are people in the future might become participants or be, available for, employment and so on and so forth? Or what do you think is behind some of the sort of the non-weaponizable or non-dual use?
I mean, hopefully
investments?
they're using the results of those research projects to be able to evaluate the impact that they have on local communities. I'm hoping, or to be able to develop like detectors for inspection and verification. Like you will hope that academia is also producing research that is going to be helpful in the future. But definitely, like, I mean, they do have inspection and verification as part of as part of what the DOE does. So hopefully they're developing a workforce that can also do that.
May return to the online, and next is Paul. From Michael May, he says, if you cast as wide a net as your examples show, then just about every nuclear physics or material structure response research can be included as nuclear weapons relevant. Are you concerned about inhibiting US research generally more than the work of foreign countries? The US and other advanced countries can use the research noted more than other countries. I read that.
I mean, I'm not concerned about inhibiting because the goal of the framework that I'm making is just to inform people. Is not to tell them, as I mentioned, not to tell them not to do the research, but just to be a little more cautious about who are you sharing the results of your research with? Like, what are you like? Just be aware that there's a risk, and also it's not in like it's the framework is also trying to rate like, is it one of the questions in the form is like, is it weaponizable in the near future? And like, in how many years? What is the timeline for a follow-up project? What is the timeline for this? What is the timeline for that? So it also has like, how risky is that and how risky is it not? So I'm not concerned that people are going to stop working on planetary core research because I'm telling them that it can be used to analyze fusion or produce a hydrogen bomb in high pressure conditions, but that people will be aware that that's the same kind of knowledge that people use to produce a hydrogen bomb or fusion. So just be careful with where you're working and what the purpose of your work is. But I'm not telling people like, don't do that.
Right, Paul.
Paul Edwards, CISAC, CIRI, and STS. So very interesting talk. Thank you. So throughout the history of the U.S. Post-World War II U.S. Armed Forces research programs, so DoD, DARPA, DOE, others like it, there's been a long history of kind of speaking to one audience about things as being essentially civilian-oriented research, and then speaking to a military audience about the same things being appropriate for the military. And so this is an interesting project you have, but it seems to depend heavily on the idea that that there will be published results that people can look at that would let them make this determination of which, whether it's likely to be weaponizable or not. So you're sort of solving the issue of, speaking out of both sides of their mouths with respect to agencies that are funding, university research. But you're also kind of depending on their willingness to let things that they're trying to get out there be published in, available fora. And, so DOE had a long history of classified research where they could keep that siloed, and then other stuff would be published, and a great deal was never published that was really much more civilian than not. Anyway, I'd just like to hear you reflect on that conundrum.
Yeah.
for what you're doing.
I mean, definitely, I'm not going to touch on things that are classified and they're directly developed by that the military is developing directly. But I think that's also speaks to the kind of audience that I want this project to like speak to. It's just like I just want scientists like myself who are in the lab in a university to be able to evaluate their own research projects. I'm not necessarily trying to make, like, it's obvious that the military is going to fund projects for military purposes, but I just want people like citizen scientists to have a more clear view of what they're pursuing, to start the discussion that wasn't there before. But I'm not trying to pretend that it's going to be an all-encompassing thing that it's going to say like everything that is weaponized was in this list. It's just like, hey, look, there's a framework for certain things that are already weaponizable if you want to take a look and try to evaluate the things that you're doing right now in your university lab. Here's what it is.
Other questions? So I have a question. Well, please go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Krumdelko. Actually, I work in robotics, and here's a comment and then the question. We have a big discussion now how dangerous AI is, and there's kind of this subtone that, well, we have to, it's dangerous, and then even though nobody's telling people not to do it, it just turns into something where you might not want to do, and so on and so forth. So to your point, yeah, it's incredibly laudable to have this conversation, but what are you actually going to do then if there is, let's say I'm a scientist, civilian scientist, and the conversation turns into, hey, this is dangerous. Should I stop doing it? Or where do you draw the line then? Or how does that, what's the end game here? It's nice to have the conversation, but what if everybody looks at me and says, hey, what you're doing is dangerous? What should I do?
The answer to that, to be very honest, is I don't know. And I've been grappling with that question for a very long time now. It's, do I tell people not to do, or not me personally, but do we generally as a society tell people not to pursue the research? I think that folks like Callie, for example, who are doing biosecurity, for example, might be grappling with that question more concurrently, because like what you make in the lab can go one and explode into, I don't know, COVID-19 more easily. But yeah, the answer to that is I don't know, and that's why I want this framework to exist, so we can start having the conversations about how do we apply safeguards to that kind of research.
You think or
I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot. So I think one answer is that it also then brings in a sense of responsibility to the scientists. Whereas before, like in the Oppenheimer movie, you might walk away and be like, oh, well, there's a bigger separation. And at least this puts more onus and responsibility on scientists so that they can't say, oh, well, I wasn't aware. And so therefore, I think it is a little bit of a shift. I mean, that's my view.
Hey, Austin Street. I'm a visiting scholar from the Air War College. Another two-finger on that is this research can be used to inform policy decisions of the research departments themselves. So if they don't want to participate in anything that they would deem as weaponizable, then they can set policy to do so. But at least they become more informed on how to enact that policy on something like this.
Yeah.
In the vein of this discussion at the moment, I want to raise the issue of unintended consequences, particularly if you're successful in creating a framework that people begin to use. Now, when you went through your list, particularly on studies of planetary interiors, I twitched a little bit because I recently published a paper on the effects of very high pressures in a diamond anvil cell on irradiated materials, in this case, a very important mineral for geochronologists. And the whole purpose of the paper was to study the phase relations and the mechanisms by which materials adjust to these high pressures, not too different than the story with the high pressure steel. And so, as I said, I twitched, but your framework doesn't exist, so I'll continue along those lines for a little longer. But what really struck me as I reflected on it is that paper is mainly with Chinese co-authors.
Mhm.
And so I think most scientists twitch when they hear the word framework. That seems to constrain our options. But worse than that, if there's a framework that the government applies that says, well, this is potentially dual purpose, and worse than that, this is a publication with Chinese authors. So have you thought about, let's say, the next iteration of possible consequences if such a framework existed?
Yeah, that's funny because I had not thought of like international collaboration. Certainly, I don't want to curb international collaborations because I was an international student. I was like a scientist from a foreign scientist. But in terms of, I guess that the thing that should be potentially like encouraged with that is that maybe what we want to do is to encourage as much collaboration as possible, so no one is just holding that knowledge and producing a weapon that they can use. But I don't have an answer for that right now.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Barbara again for her fine presentation.